Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the RoP Debrief session. We'll be waiting for a few minutes for the rest of the participants. So we have Sasha D'Souza among us, the chairperson for the UN ODC, who will be briefing us about the RoP. And over to Sasha.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm so excited to be here again, year after year, to speak to all of you about SAPMAN and about what we do and what we'll be expecting during the conference. So, SAPMAN follows the normal UNA USA procedure that is standard throughout most MUNs. So, before I go into the intricacies of what happens in an MUN, I will just generally talk about what the UN is first. Okay. So, as many of you might know, the UN is an organization that is the successor of an organization called League of Nations. Okay. So, the League of Nations was established after the World War, and their main objective was to prevent another World War. But unfortunately, the Second World War did happen. And as a successor of the League of Nations, we have something called the United Nations. And all the member nations just want to promote peace and prevent another world war. Because let's face it, the World War was not fun for anybody. It had mass destruction and it was basically not convenient for anyone. War. So what we do at SAP1 is we don't really replicate what happens in the United Nations because it's a very complex procedure, but we try to take inspiration from it, or we simulate a sort of. So we basically take their structure and we use their structure to debate on points and problems in different arenas in the world because we have so many different problems. So it gets easier to tackle these problems when we put them in groups. And when we put them in groups, we are able to analyze them better. And that is why we divide us into the committees. So some of the committees that you might be aware of is the United Nations Security Council. So the mandate of the Security Council is to prevent war. They discuss about land disputes, border disputes. For example, the border dispute at Kashmir, at Doklam between India and Pakistan and India and China. These are some examples. Now, the United Nations Security Council, one of the main features is that it has something called the permanent five members that have the almighty veto power. So these P5 nations are also part of this United Nations Security Council. Now, United Nations Security Council focuses on areas like promotion of peace, security, disarmament, war, things like that. But on a humanitarian side, we have uh, a committee called the Human Rights Commission, which discusses human rights issues, violations, and things like that. Like, for example, if we talk about what's happening in Afghanistan right now, many of you might be aware that there is massive human rights violations. So all of these are spoken about in the Human Rights Commission. And we discuss this and deliberate what we can do as a world community to solve these problems that everyone has. We also have committees like the World Health Organization, and as the name suggests, it deals with problems around health, like for example, take the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic that has struck the world. We're discussing ways to properly tackle this virus. How can we increase the availability of vaccines, things like that. So this is how we're going to divide So first of all, you'll be given a portfolio. I'm sure most of you have already received your portfolio. So your portfolio will There is a small technical issue that we're dealing with. We'll be letting everyone in and resuming the session shortly. Okay, I think we'll jump right back in where we left. So I was talking about how we research. So when you're given a country and a committee, you first have to research about everything your country has to know about, the positives, the negatives, what your contributions are, where you lack in contributions, what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses as a country, who are your allies, who are not your allies, who have you had wars with, who have you had disagreements with, what your prime minister or your head of state has to say about the problem that you're discussing in committee. Okay, so it's really simple. You just have to first research about your agenda, which is basically the topic that you'll be talking about. So every agenda is going to have a central theme. So figure out what the central theme is, research about the central theme, and then try to connect it with your foreign relations. Foreign policy is just simple. It is what your country's relations are with neighboring countries. Let me take a normal, simple example. Let's take India as an example. Our relations would be that we have strained relations with China and Pakistan due to border disputes, but we also have very good relations with some other countries due to trade and other foreign policies. Okay. I'm going to now dive into the questions, the rules of procedure that we're going to have in committee while we're having the speaking sessions. Okay. So first of all, the most important thing that you need to start with is understanding your representation. Okay. So your representation is not that you go there as yourself. You don't go there. I don't go there as Sasha. I go there as the delegate of X or Y country that I've been given. Okay. So I speak as the head of my state, and whatever I speak is an essence of what the country believes, what their foreign policies are, and what is possible for that country when it comes to limitations and economic power and military power. So you have to keep all this in mind. Okay. So when we start something in committee, we usually set the agenda. Okay. So sometimes in other MUNs, we have two agendas, which is why we have to sometimes choose between these two agendas. But in our MUN, I think most of our committees all have an agenda already set, but we still do this formally. Then we have something called the roll call. Now in roll call, it's basically like assembly in the morning, except we also have to declare our stance. Okay. So we have two responses when your chairperson calls out your country name. It's either present or present and voting. Okay. The only difference between present and voting is that present means that you're going to be there in committee and discuss things, but you're not sure about your stance when it comes to the resolution in the end. But present and voting means that you do know your stance and you know exactly which side of the agenda you fall on based on your foreign policy. Okay. After we set our agenda and we have our roll call, we have something called the speakers list. Okay. So the speakers list is a 90-second speech made by every delegate. And it basically declares their stance in detail on the agenda. Okay. So in simple words, it just basically means anything and everything under the big sun that is our agenda, we can talk about in the speakers list. It has to be 90 seconds and it has to be on the perspective of the delegate as the delegate of the country that they have been given. Okay. So what happens when you don't use the entire 90 seconds that you've been allotted? Okay, now let's say, for example, I'm a delegate that has used only 50 seconds of the 90 seconds that they were supposed to use. Okay, so what happens to the 40 seconds left? We have something called yields. Okay, so we have a few types of yields, that is yield to another delegate, yield to question, and yield to the chair. Okay, so yield to the chair means that you would simply use this time and give it back to the chair. That means basically means that you don't want to do much with your time. In some cases, your chairperson might use this to ask you a question. Okay, we have another yield which is called yield to question, which means that you would yield this time to other delegates to question you on the content of the speech made by the delegate previously. We also have yeah, okay. Uh,
Excuse me, ma'am. I think you're muted.
okay, thank you for that. Okay, moving on. Okay, moving on. Sorry for the inconvenience. So we're moving back to yields. So now let's say, for example, my friend in committee needs some more time because she has a lengthy speech. So I will use my time to give it to her. Okay, so you will understand this better when you sit in committee and this is happening, because I understand right now this probably sounds like a bunch of random words put together and it just sounds like a bunch of random rules, but it's not that difficult. You'll understand when you're sitting in committee and it's practically happening. Okay, so after yields, I will bring you to another small section. Okay, so we'll do this entire rules of procedure in small sections so it's easier for you to understand and recall later. Okay, so we'll go to something called motions. Okay, MOTIONS. Okay, motions. So motions are divided mainly on two levels. Okay, one is formal and one is informal. Okay, so let's come to the formal aspect of it. Okay, we have something called a moderated caucus. Okay, I'll just type it in the chat here. I don't think they can see the chat, right? So I'll spell it for you. MODERATEDCAUCUS. Okay. So a moderated caucus is basically discussion of the agenda in more comprehensible parts. Okay. I'll explain this to you with an example. Okay. So let's say our agenda is a pizza. Okay. That's just out of the oven. Okay. We can't eat the pizza just like that, right? I mean, it would be a lot of fun, but it would be a little difficult to finish that pizza if you just eat it without cutting it up, right? So a moderated caucus is the cutting of this pizza into bite-sized pieces. Okay. Now let's say now our agenda as a pizza is women empowerment. Okay. So now we break this big pizza into bite-sized pieces so that we can eat it better. So what happens is when we break it down, we're able to analyze the problem better so that we can deal with small segments of the problem and then come to better conclusions as a whole. Okay. So moderated caucus has a verbatim that your chairpersons will be telling you later. And it's also there in the rules of procedure that we'll be sending. Then we come to something called the unmoderated caucus. Okay. So an unmoderated caucus is basically free time given to you guys in committee so that you can lobby or do your paperwork. Basically, free time given for that is not moderated by the chairperson that you can use to build your relations in committee. I spoke of working papers. I'll be explaining that a little later. Now let's move to points. Okay. So the difference between a motion and a point is that a motion is bringing attention to the entire committee of something that you want to do. So it's actionable. A point is something that you bring to the attention of the chairperson or a few members in committee. Okay. So now there is something called the order of precedence. The order of precedence simply means that one point will be recognized earlier in committee than the other points. Now, let's say, for example, there are 5 people with 5 different points. Okay. The chairperson will act on these points based on the order of precedence. Okay. So the order of precedence, you understood. Okay. Anyway, so the first point is very simple. It is basically saying you want to go to the washroom, or you want the fan lowered, or you want someone to speak louder, or you want someone to get you some switch off the light, or basically it's along logistical issues. So it's called the point of personal privilege. Personal privilege, that means that it applies to you. Okay, so you need to use the washroom, you are feeling any personal discomfort, you need to leave. You need a point to be said again, or a motion to be repeated again because you did not hear it. All these would come under personal privilege. Now, point of information, that comes second. Okay, so now let's say someone has made a speech. Okay, a point of information is a question to the speech of the delegate. Okay, so now let's say, for example, I've spoken about rising gas prices and inflation. So if someone has any questions regarding the content of my speech, that is about rising gas prices and inflation, they would ask me the question. Okay. Next, we come to something called the point of order. Okay. So the point of order is pointing out a factual fallacy or a factual inaccuracy in the speech made by any delegate. Now, let's say, for example, I say India is the world's most populated country, but it is a well-known fact that China is the world's most populated country. So if someone catches that point, they will raise a point of order and say, ma'am has made a point of order because China is the world's most populated country and not India. So you need to keep your ear out for anybody making these small mistakes because they do hold a lot of points. Okay. We then come to the last point, which is also last on the order of precedence. That means that it's the least important when it's stacked up against each other. It is the point of parliamentary inquiry. Okay, so point of parliamentary inquiry is very simple. It just sounds a little complicated. It just means that you have a question regarding the rules of procedure, regarding the procedures in committee, anything. Basically a question to the chairperson. And let's say, for example, I'm the chairperson here, and somebody is having little confusion regarding who's going to go first in the speaking list. And he or she would raise a point of parliamentary inquiry asking me what the order of the speakers is. Okay. I'm just going to take one small tiny break here. And I think that we're going to take a few questions before I move to the next part. Okay, so if any of you have any small questions regarding anything that I have said up until now, just either put it in the chat box or you can even unmute and ask me right now. Any doubts? There are no silly questions.
For the GSL,
Yes.
would that be, is the GSL a non-exhaustible list?
It would be in this case, yes.
And we can speak again if we want to.
Yes, so depending on your chairpersons, they'll either have an alphabetical order where everyone will have to do it once, and then we'll have people who want to be added to it again. Have I answered your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I think there are a few questions that are coming in here. would the same rules hold for Lok Sabha as well? I was just going to come to this. So there are only a few minor differences in the Lok Sabha rules of procedure and the uh, normal other committees as well. But these intricacies, I am not um, expert at, but your chairperson is someone that is really, really good at it. I mean, he'll be teaching you guys the differences, but it's just minor changes. The general structure remains the same. The general idea stays the same. That we all discuss the same the problem, and we just the paperwork and things like that are a little different because of the terminologies, but the general idea remains the same. I hope I've answered your question. Another delegate is asked, what do I do if I get a country that takes both sides in a pressing issue like Canada in dissect? See, Canada in dissect is a vast thing because dissect speaks of a lot of issues. Like, for example, Canada is on the fence about the nuclear warfare issue. I mean, they're on both sides. But when it comes to disarmament, they might have a different stance. So you need to figure out what it is in your agenda that is the central topic and what your country feels about this central topic, whether they are for, whether they're against. Is there something that they're doing? Is that a problem in your country? Is that going to directly affect something in your country? Is your country doing something to help it? You need to generally figure that out. Okay. Next, we have a question. What kind of speech would people who want to be a part of speakers list prepare? Okay, so speakers list is a general speech that declares the country's stance on the agenda. Now let me give you an example to make you understand this better. Now let's say, for example, we are talking about equal pay for men and women. Okay, maybe some countries will be for it, some countries might feel staunchly against it for whatever reasons they are. Now, depending on what your country feels for it. Now, let's say, for example, USA. If I was the country USA and we're talking about equal wages for men and women, my country is for equal wages for men and women, but we also recognize there are some problems in the system. And why is this not happening? So my speakers list could maybe contain that, we do support equal pay for men and women. And these are the problems that we're facing. Why is this problem happening? What are the things we are doing as a government to decrease this problem or to tackle this problem? So that would be the content of your speech. I hope I've answered your question.
Before we go ahead, we have a question from Aryan Bindal. How shall we say our point? Should we raise our flag or something in order the chair recognizes us?
Okay. So I should have said this. I'm so sorry, I forgot. But so generally what happens is there is a moderator for your debate. Okay. So the moderator is going to be a chairperson and a vice chairperson or both or either one. And they are going to moderate the debate. So what happens is when these motions are raised, they are raised when the chairperson asks, are there any points or motions on the floor? And they're going to periodically ask you that. Okay. So when the chairperson asks for points or asks for motions, anyone who wishes to raise a point or motions or a point or motion will do that at that time. Okay, I hope I've answered your question. Do we have no questions? Yeah, we do. Good evening, ma'am. What is the duration for us to speak about our country's decision? So depending on what speech it is, there are different timings. So the speaker's list is a 90-second speech, but a moderated caucus is a maximum of 1 minute. That is 60 seconds. Okay, depending on what you set it at. I hope I've answered your question. Okay, so someone has a question about what a substantive chit is. Now, let's say, for example, I have a lot of information, but I might not be recognized by the chair as much because there are a lot of people who are talking as well with equally valid points. So what happens now is that you can send the chairperson sort of a chit that has the substance of your speech sent as a chit, which is why we call it a substantive chit. So a substantive chit is basically a chit that you send with all your points. There is no format as such. You can just send it in uh, more comprehensible ways because rather than sending long paragraphs that the chairperson would find difficult to read as they're moderating the session, they're checking the time, they're listening to what you're saying. So it's better if you send them small like points of what you have to say in the substantive chit. So the substantive chit is marked, but it might not be as much as saying a speech or orally presenting it, but it will still give you a certain amount of marks depending on how your chairperson is marking. Okay. I hope I've answered your question. Can we use position of personal privilege if we are personally uncomfortable with a question or discussion? Now, this again is a layered question because personal privilege is usually like an immediate thing. Let's say, for example, I need to use the restroom. I would use the point of personal privilege, but I'm feeling really cold right here. So I will use the point of personal privilege. Or one of the delegates right there is making a speech and I can't hear the delegate because they're too far away or they're speaking too softly. I will raise a point of personal privilege and ask them to speak a little louder. But if there is something that your country will feel uncomfortable with. Now, let's say, for example, someone speaks of the ethnic cleansing in China, and China feels like they're deeply offended by this. Then you can raise something called a right to reply, but that again will be something that comes very later on. So, in a simple way, yes, in sometimes, but sometimes, let's say, for example, you're asked a question. Now, let's say the president of Afghanistan is asked about what he feels about what's happening in his country. He might refrain from replying because he's a head of state. So there are a few intricacies of it. Okay. Are these all the questions? Have I missed anything out? Okay. I think that's it. I'll move to the next segment, that is paperwork. Okay. Again, paperwork comes in two segments, formal paperwork and informal paperwork. Now, formal paperwork is the resolution that is basically, uh, putting it lightly, have you seen that lady who sits on the side of the courtroom and she types everything that's happening? That's basically a resolution. Everything that has been spoken about in committee, plus the working papers that have been passed and voted on, are included in this resolution. Resolution is basically the end result, like your report card that you're showing to your parents at the end of it. This is what we spoke about. These are the issues that we spoke about. These are the solutions that we came up with. It. These are the ways that we think we can implement these solutions. So all that's going to go in your draft resolution. So now draft resolution is a structured document that is very formal. I'm not going to get into that right now because it's just a format that your chairpersons will be letting you know on the second day of debate. But it's basically all you need to know is that everything that is discussed in committee goes there. So it's an important document. Now, moving to the more casual documents that you'll be making, that is the informal documents, something called the working paper. Okay, so working papers are basically documentations of these moderated caucuses and different segments of debate in committee. Now, let's say, for example, we're talking about education as a whole, or we're talking about unemployment. If we're talking about unemployment, there are so many things that come under it, like unemployment among and poverty and education and its link and infrastructure and its link to unemployment, all these things. So working papers basically document each of these segments so that it's easier for us to put it in our draft resolution later, as well as it's a way of documenting each segment of it so that we can analyze it better later on for solutions to our problems and implementations of it. So working papers don't really have a format, but it's generally around, it's generally better for you to present it well so that the chairperson can see that you're fact oriented and that you can see that this is the name, this everything has to be comprehensive basically. So I would suggest that you include the name of your working paper. You can have a very informal name. You can have a creative name. You can keep it as whatever you like, as working paper noodles, working paper Captain America, working paper Superman, whatever you like. Okay. That is the name of the working paper. It also has to include the author of the working paper. Okay, author of the working paper is basically you, whoever writes it, and the topic of the working paper. So the topic of the working paper is going to be the central theme of the working paper or the segment that I was mentioning earlier. Okay, so the content of the working paper is going to be in points, much like the substantive JITs. And they should be concise and precise, maybe 3 to 5 points, maximum 6 points, because it's not a resolution, right? It's concise things that we've spoken about in committee. And you have to send that through the chip system that we have. Okay. Do we have any more questions? I don't think so.
Yes.
Yeah.
We have a question from Alvin. He asks, what if I get a country that hasn't decided whether they are with a issue or against it?
See, then you would have to look at the values of the country. Okay, now let's say, for example, if there is some country that has staunch Islamic values, they might be against abortion. They might not say anything vocally, but they will be against abortion because religiously it's sanctioned for them to be against it. Okay, so now let's say, for example, another example. Let's say some countries want to have agricultural reforms. Some countries might be staunchly against it. But then you look at the composition of that country. Look at how is it going to affect the demographic of that country. So if there is no direct implication of whether they are for or against, basically think about what they could be for or against based on other facts and other figures. I hope I've answered your question. There's another question.
Okay, so Sasha, we have another question from Apeksha. She asks, when is the working paper written?
Okay, so good question. So the working paper can be written anytime. Okay, it just has to be sent periodically to the chairperson, after which sometimes we discuss and vote upon these working papers. Now, what happens when this working paper is passed? When it is passed, as I mentioned earlier, it is included in the draft resolution. Okay, so the working papers, a great time to do your working papers is when you have an unmoderated caucus. When you're doing lobbying, you can sit and finish off your working papers and send it as well, so that in the next discussion, you can discuss the working paper and have it passed as well. I hope I answered your question. Yeah, I think that is it. We are almost done. That is for the most part. Anything else you can ask your chairpersons, and I am pretty sure they'll be more than happy to guide you along the way. I hope you have understood even a little part of it, because I understand that right now this is like this extreme sensory overload of a lot of feelings and like mixed emotions and so much information. So I totally understand. But just take a deep breath, just go research about your country and just dive into some not Wikipedia. Please don't use Wikipedia as a source. Use other viable news sources or the CIA fact book or routers and all these sources. Okay. Yeah, so just don't be nervous. Just take this as it comes and just focus on your research for now, and everything else should be fine. Okay. So I think that is it. Thank you so much for having me and so patiently listening to me go on and on about rules of procedure. I hope we can see you soon. Before I leave, are there any more questions?
If my country is against a topic for the entire time, and I'm quite satisfied with for the topic, so while doing the resolutions, can I go for it then, or do I have to stick with my country, be against?
So basically, when you come to an MUN and you're given a portfolio, you have to throw all your personal opinions outside. Okay, so it's happened a lot of times. You might staunchly believe in something, but your country's stance might not. So, what is important is that you diplomatically uh, defend your stance, whatever it is, even if it's not in accordance to your personal opinion. Okay, Vanshika, I hope this answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Anybody else? What is a position paper? Okay, so position paper, we are not really having position papers. We don't usually have them anymore. But position papers are basically a document, much like your working paper, that declares your stance on the agenda. So you have to give this to your chairperson before the conference starts, okay? Before maybe the roll call or before, uh, we all sit down and stuff. So this is not really necessary in this MUN because we usually don't, but you can prepare one if you like. So position paper basically tells the chairperson that you know what your stance is, whether you know it's for, it's against. So basically just a few points that come under the agenda. Okay, position paper. I hope I answered your question.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes.
So I wanted to know how a resolution is co-sponsored by many countries. So it's an online MUN. So how are we going to like form alliances or something like that if we want to co-sponsor a resolution?
Okay, so for the people who don't know what a sponsor or a co-sponsor is, in other words, it is the author and the co-author of the draft resolution. Okay, so in other MUNs, what we see is that we are able to physically be here and go and make relations with and make friends and say, okay, be on my side or I'll be the author, you be the co-author. But we have seen that even though it is an online MUN, we have been able to effectively establish the same sort of relations during unmoderated caucuses. Okay. And at SAP1, all our chairpersons are really fun and interactive, which is why we're able to also do this during sessions. Okay. So don't worry too much about how we're going to be authors and co-authors. We're just at SAP1, we focus more on the debate and the fun part of it and the interaction and having to talk to so many new people and talk about so many other things. So I hope I've answered your question.
This is my first time doing an MUN. So while the session is going on and I have a doubt on how I'm supposed to start talking, can I ask the chairperson?
Yes, at any time, all our chairpersons are really nice. They might look scary and intimidating, but they're all really nice. And anytime you have any question, just raise a point of parliamentary inquiry, and I'm pretty sure they'll be happy to help.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Any questions? Just unmute or raise your hand, whatever you feel like to. Is there another question?
I've got a question from Emin. Can you explain what is a working paper once more?
Okay, sure. Okay. So let me give you an example. Okay, now let's say, for example, we have been talking about deforestation and soil erosion. Okay, so we'll be talking about so many things, and it gets really difficult for the committee to talk about, to later document what exactly we have spoken about. Okay, so the working papers make this a little easier. So working papers are basically documentation of what you have spoken in a specific moderated caucus. Do you remember I spoke to you guys about how we slice this pizza into bite-sized pieces that we can eat better? So while eating this pizza, whatever we have discussed into the solutions, the implementations, how can we solve this problem? We've discussed all of this, right? So this is going to be documented on paper so that we can include it in our resolution later on. Okay, so that's it. Working papers are really simple actually. You just have to note down your points and send it to your chairperson so that they can document it. I hope I've answered your question. Is that it?
We have another question. What if we do not know what actually to answer when somebody asks the question?
I hope that you don't encounter a situation like that, but in the likely case that you do, you can just tell them that you'll get back to them, go back, do your research during the unmoderated caucus, and then get back to them, maybe via chat or in committee session later. So one thing that I missed out on is that during committee session, you're not allowed to use your laptop and like Google stuff and stuff. Only during your unmoderated caucus you can do that, okay? Because it's not fair, right? It's always better to be there with your research beforehand. Yeah, I think that's it for that part of the question. I hope I answered your question.
Another question. How will chits be answered in an online manner?
So you'll be sending the chits to your chairperson, either on private chat or on the chat there by mentioning it. But this again comes by the discretion of your executive board members. So I might feel like I want to have it sent on direct message, but some other chairperson might feel like he wants it on everyone's chat. So it depends on your chairperson. Someone has raised their hand. Who's that? Someone's raised their hand, right?
Yes. So
Yes.
if we like whatever we have researched, those papers, could we keep them in the session to refer them?
Yes, you can. Just no internet. You can have your notebooks there. You can have saved web pages, but just no surfing on the internet for information while someone's talking or while the committee session is happening. Just while your unmoderated caucus is happening, your lunch break and all that, you can use the internet. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a request. Could you explain unmoderated caucus in short again?
Okay, so unmoderated caucus is very simple. It's just basically free time given to you guys to do other things other than speaking. Okay, like for example, work on your working papers, form alliances, talk to your friends in committee about what you want to do next. Go as a committee together to save time. Like, say, for example, last year, SAP1, during every unmoderated caucus, my delegates would discuss what they would want to speak of next. So immediately after that, they would speak, all vote on the same thing so that the time is saved. You understand? So unmoderated caucus is basically recess time given for you guys. You can go to the washroom, drink water, do your working paper, and all that. Any more?
We have another question. How do we officially find information of a country?
Okay, that's a very good question. So a lot of times, governments have websites, like a lot of the Indian websites, like these welfare program websites, or the Prime Minister's slogan websites, or the ruling party's manifesto. All of these things are things that you would look for. Plus, you would also look at the general idea of the public as well when it comes to these issues or these areas of interest that we're talking about. So we would also refer to magazines or any sorts of articles or old UN resolutions or other UN-based sources or sources that your country recognizes. Now, let's say, for example, the USA, the United States of America, they use the CIA fact book as their source of information. That is basically the compilation of all the things that the CIA, the intelligence has. It's basically their fact book. But maybe UK might not necessarily feel that this is valid. So it depends on what your country finds valid or not. But I would prefer that you stay away from Wikipedia and all these other unrecognized websites, because a lot of times, like you say, we put a lot of masala mish to everything, and there might not be a lot of truth in what is out there. So okay, so we have a question. Someone has asked us what a press release is in Enquiry. So since we have the international press as well as our as a committee at SAPMAN, press release is basically we don't really have a press release at SAPMAN. We have something called the press conference rather. So we send a few members of the press and they ask delegates in committee questions based on the speeches that they have made in committee. But it's just like a fun question answer session with these people who come outside committee and come inside committee and ask us questions based on what we've spoken about. It gets a lot of fun. Yeah, I think that's it.
There's a question. Which are the sources you would recommend for Lok Sabha?
For Lok Sabha, I would strongly recommend using news channels as your source or newspaper articles, as well as Lok Sabha recordings that you can find. And there are documentations of what has happened in the Lok Sabha as well. So you can find those. And as well as parliament videos and things like that. And also, I use this when I am a delegate in the Lok Sabha. I look at the tweets of the leader I might be given, because a lot of times you see that you find out their stance on a lot of things that you might not find on the internet, but on their personal accounts and on their party accounts as well. Okay, I think, are we done?
There is a question. Could you give us a more clearer idea of working paper? There are a few who haven't completely understood that.
Okay. A working paper is basically us writing down what we have spoken about in these moderated caucuses. Let me give you an example. Okay. Now let's say our agenda is unemployment, okay, or poverty. Okay. Let's say poverty is our agenda. Now, poverty as a whole, when we discuss it, it gets a little difficult to discuss a vast topic like this. So we divide it. Okay. So poverty, when we divide it, now let's say we're thinking of ways to eradicate poverty. So in a situation like this, we would talk about increasing employment, increasing education, increasing employment in the public sector. Okay. So now let's say all of these have to be put in a working paper. Why? Because we are documenting this. Okay. So it is just simple. Whatever we're speaking of under these moderated caucuses and under this general agenda that we break down is a working paper. Okay. I think it'll be easier for you to understand this if we, once we start committee. I understand that right now it's a lot of information, but as soon as you're in committee with your chairpersons and in the first 10 minutes, all of these doubts will be clear, because you'll understand exactly where all these segments that I have told you guys all come to place. Okay. So just hang on for a bit and I'm sure you'll get the hang of it pretty soon. I'm assuming that most of you are first timers. but your first MUN is going to be your most memorable one. So I'm so glad that you guys are at SAP1. Are we done? Do we have more questions? No? Okay. Yeah, one question.
What do we do if our country has a neutral opinion on the agenda? What do we do if our country has a neutral opinion on the agenda?
Then you remain neutral on the agenda and you speak of implementations and solutions that you can think of. Okay. So if you're neutral or for or against doesn't mean much. It just changes the way that you would tackle the moderated caucuses or the way that you answer to them. Okay, that's it. Yeah, I think I'm so glad that we had so many questions. It shows that you guys were listening to me. But I hope that most of your questions are answered. If not, I think you can email them to us and we'll email it to me and I'll be more than happy to answer. Or you can keep it for your chairpersons and trouble them instead.
We have a question from Shari. When are we supposed to submit the position paper for DISEC?
I don't know because I am not your chairperson and I'm not sure if DISEC is taking position papers, but I think we will put up a story update. Can we do that? Maybe we can put it up on the Instagram page and you guys can check it out in case that we do need one. But I think to be safe, you guys can just work on it. And on the first day of the committee, you can give it to them. Instead of doing that story update thing, I think let's just keep it at this. The ones who feel like they want to do a position paper, you can prepare a position paper and keep it till we meet in committees with your chairpersons. Okay. Yeah, another question.
What sources would you personally recommend?
What sources I would personally recommend? So I love routers as a source. I like Britannica as a source for humanitarian things. I would go through a lot of the UN resolutions that are under the topic that is in discussion. I would, if it's a humanitarian committee, I would look at the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, the UNDHR. I would also go and look at some news channels like the BBC, but Routers is a very good place for you to look at like events that have happened. There's a small hack that all of you guys can use. There's this channel called Geography Now. A friend of mine who was also my chairperson had once given me this channel. It's on YouTube and he has, I think, most countries, and he talks about the demographic and like their relation. So it makes you understand. It's a good basis to have to understand your country better for debate. Okay.
Could you please again explain briefly what a position paper is?
A position paper is basically documented stance of the agenda. Okay, so now let's say, for example, I am the delegate of USA and we're talking about increasing trade to South Asian countries. Okay, now let's say I am for it. So in my position paper, I would say that the delegate of USA hereby declares that USA as a country stands for the increase of trade or fair trade in the South Asian countries. And I would elaborate on why, maybe in 300 to 600 words. Okay, but it's not extremely important that you stick to that specific word count. Okay.
I had a question. Can you brief about substantial chits and how they matter to the chairperson and how much points they give based on that?
Okay, so a lot of times you might not be able to effectively finish the entire content of your speech in the time duration that you've been allotted. Okay, so that time you might send the chit to the chairperson called the substantive chit. Okay, the substantive chit is basically whatever you have not said, that you write it down and you send it to the chairperson. Now the chairperson will read this and he'll know that this delegate has all these points but were unable to make these points. So he or she will mark you based on what you have said. Now, when it comes to marking, substantive chits don't hold as much points as your speech would, but it is like a small segment of it. But it's still very important because it helps the chairperson understand that you're a well-researched delegate and that you actually have, substance in your speeches. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
What are the mistakes to avoid in a month?
See, I believe it is very important for you to go into an MUN with a very positive state of mind. Okay, I believe it is very important for you to understand that it is more important to learn something rather than win. Okay, having said that, the mistakes I would avoid is not being prepared, because a lot of times you might think, okay, I'm a good speaker, I can go and I can just speak it off and I can, say something. But a lot of times what happens is you might be overconfident or underconfident and you might not prepare as much. But preparing really is the key. Okay. And it is very important to understand your foreign relations. Okay. It'll be a joke if India and Pakistan together have something, maybe in the Kashmir conflict or something like that. So you need to understand exactly what your foreign policy stands for. What are your nation's values? Wouldn't it be funny if some nation that is staunchly super Catholic says that we are for abortion now? No. So you need to understand the intricacies of your portfolio. So understanding your portfolio is very important. And you also need to understand how to conduct yourself in committee. A lot of times, a lot of delegates act a little smart and things like that with the chairperson and might disrupt committee. They might think that they're being funny or cool or whatever, but it sometimes does disrupt committee. So that also pays, that also affects your score, because there's something called verbatim, staying in decorum. And yeah, so those are some of the mistakes I would avoid. You have another question, I think.
Would you recommend Al Jazeera as a trusted source?
Yeah, you could use Al Jazeera as a source. Most of the times you will not have to declare your source. It just has to be, just logically think about whether the following fact will be okay for you to use. But Al Jazeera is a pretty good source for you to use. Do we have more questions? Yes?
There is one more question. What is lobbying?
Okay, lobbying is just a fancy word for speaking to people. Okay, lobbying basically is, now let's say, for example, we have 6 people in this room. Okay, and I have to get my working paper passed. So I will go and speak to each of these people nicely and say, hi, I'm from Aloysius, and we have this Sapman thing every year. I start talking. That's my lobbying. That's how my lobbying will start. Say, oh, by the way, I also have this working paper. It'd be nice if you passed it. They'll say next. Yeah, sure. Then they go to the next person and say, hi, I'm from Aloysius. Where are you from? How are you? So that's basically lobbying. Okay. No, you don't have to name any of your facts or sources, but it is always better to know that your source is viable, because in case later on someone has a point of order, if you remember what I said earlier, point of order is pointing out a factual fallacy or a factual inaccuracy. Okay, so when someone raises a point of order, then later on you might need to say that, this is the source of my data, and that person's source of data will be compared, and whichever is the more viable source based on the judgment of the chairperson, it will be decided. Okay. Yeah.
Can you give us tips on writing a speech?
Try to keep it comprehensible, make sure more people can understand. Stick to the time limit. Okay, it's very important to stick to the time limit, because if you go M&M on our chairpersons after the time is up, they're not going to listen to you. once they bang the table or they tell you that the time is over, please stick to that, because each like additional 5 minutes that we waste on this is lost, because we could have come up with 5 solutions rather.
Can you please give some tips on as to how to prepare speeches for Lok Sabha?
See, the difference in the speeches in Lok Sabha and in a conventional UN committee is that UN committees are based on country stances, but Lok Sabha speeches are based on the stance or your party whip. That is the whip is basically your ideologies. Okay, so now let's say, for example, so basically all you have to keep in mind is you need to figure out your stance. Once you have your stance sorted and you figure out your agenda and where you stand on it, then you can basically wing everything else. So while sometimes in Lok Sabha, we also have these independent candidates. Now, independent candidates, you will have to look at their tweets and things like that, or put independent candidates in a separate on one side of the agenda, depending on your stance. Okay. Yes.
Is it okay to violate the foreign policy?
No, that's my entire point. Don't try not to violate your foreign policy. Even if it's really hard for you to say something because you don't believe in it, you might have to violate your principles, but don't violate your foreign policy. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question. What is the time limit for a speech?
So depending on what this speech is, a delegate. So if it's a speaker's list, it's 90 seconds. But if it's a moderated caucus, we have a maximum of 1 minute per speaker. Okay. Okay, I think that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for listening to us and being so enthusiastic. I love the questions and the amount of interaction we had. Thank you, guys. I think that is it.
Thank you.
We thank the delegates for joining us today, and the further updates will be given to you on the WhatsApp groups. Thank you.